I arrived at the beach house feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. The plan was simple. A quiet weekend, just me and the sound of the waves. David had stayed in town, busy with work, and I longed for a moment of peace. I opened the door and, to my surprise, saw John, my cousin, already settled in the living room. "John, what are you doing here?" I asked, trying to disguise my shock. He looked up from the book he was reading and smiled, that smile that always brightened up any room. "Emily, I didn't know you were coming. I thought I'd spend a few days away from everything," he explained, getting up to hug me. The hug was quick, but intense. That contact rekindled something inside me, something I didn't know still existed. As we settled into the house, the tension between us was palpable. Every look we exchanged seemed to carry hidden meanings. John's eyes were deep, as if they were trying to uncover my innermost secrets. And I knew he had his own secrets, too. "Are you all right?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, I'm just surprised to find you here," I replied, trying to sound casual. But the truth was that my heart was racing, and I couldn't understand why. We dined in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. John's presence was both comforting and disturbing. I felt torn, like I was on the brink of something I couldn't control. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this unexpected encounter would change everything. What was happening to me? And why did that beach house seem like the perfect setting for a drama I didn't want to face? The tension between us grew by the second, and I knew that this weekend was going to be anything but peaceful. Of course, here is Emily's personal account in first person, as requested. The beach house has always been my refuge. I arrived there alone, with my heart racing and my mind full of expectations for a peaceful weekend. David was stuck on a business trip, so I thought I could use these days to reconnect with myself. As I opened the door to the house, I smelled a familiar scent of sea air and old wood. I left my suitcase in the hallway and went straight into the living room, where I expected to find only silence and calm. But to my surprise, there was John, my cousin, already settled on the sofa with a book in his hand. "John?" I asked, unable to hide the astonishment in my voice. He looked up and smiled in a way that made my heart beat even faster. "Emily? I didn't know you were coming." The initial shock gave way to a wave of nostalgia. John and I had always had a special connection. In childhood, we were inseparable. We spent hours playing on the beach, building sandcastles and sharing secrets. But over time, life pulled us apart. He pursued his career in another city, while I married David and concentrated on my own life. The tension between us was palpable as we settled into the house. Every look we exchanged was loaded with unspoken meanings. There was something in the air, a mixture of comfort and discomfort, that made me uneasy. We decided to open a bottle of wine to relax. We sat on the balcony, facing the sea, and started talking. We talked about our lives, our achievements and challenges. We laughed about old memories, and little by little, the old friendship was rekindled. "Remember that time you nearly drowned and I had to pull you out onto the sand?" John asked, laughing. "How could I forget?" I replied, laughing too. "You were my hero that day." But as the night progressed, something deeper began to emerge. The attraction between us was undeniable, even though I was married to David. John touched my hand affectionately for the first time, and a shiver ran through my body. His eyes met mine, and before I could process what was happening, he kissed me. It was an unexpected kiss, full of intensity and surprise. I pulled away quickly, my heart beating wildly. "John," I started to say, but he interrupted me. "I know, Emily. It was a mistake. I'm sorry." But deep down, I knew it wasn't a mistake. There was something there, a flame that I couldn't ignore. The guilt of thinking about David was overwhelming, but the attraction to John was irresistible. I tried to keep my emotional distance, but with every furtive touch, the sexual tension grew. That night, as the heavy silence took over the room, my resistance crumbled. I couldn't fight the desire any longer. I gave myself completely to John, and the passion that consumed us was overwhelming. I felt like I was betraying David. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: my life would never be the same again. We decided to open a bottle of wine to relax. I was nervous. I needed something to calm my thoughts and perhaps clarify my feelings. John seemed calmer than me, but there was a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. "Would you like some?" he asked, holding up the bottle of red wine. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound casual. We sat on the balcony, the sound of the waves in the background creating the perfect soundtrack for the evening. We started chatting about trivial things: work, family, our lives since we last saw each other. As the wine flowed, the conversations became deeper, and confessions began to emerge. "You seem happy with David," he said, but there was an unspoken question in his eyes. "Yes, I am. But sometimes I feel that something is missing," I confessed, almost unable to believe I had said it out loud. John looked at me in a way that made my heart beat faster. "I understand. Sometimes I feel like that too." There was a sincerity in his voice that moved me. We were silent for a moment, just looking at each other. Then suddenly, he reached out and touched my hand. It was a light touch, almost imperceptible, but I felt a surge of electricity run through my body. "Emily, he started to say, but stopped, as if he didn't know how to continue. I knew what he meant, because I felt the same way. Before I could think, I leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft kiss, hesitant, but charged with an intensity I had never felt before. When we broke apart, we looked at each other, surprised and breathless. "That was," I started to say, but he interrupted me. "I know," he said. "I felt it too." We didn't know what to do next. There was so much to say, so much to feel, but words seemed insufficient. We sat there on the balcony, holding hands, listening to the sound of the waves, and trying to understand what had just happened. The night was cold, but I felt warm inside. John's touch, the kiss, everything felt so right and so wrong at the same time. I thought of David, of how he trusted me, and a wave of guilt washed over me. But when I looked at John, all I could feel was desire. "Emily, I didn't mean for it to happen like this," said John, his voice full of regret. "I didn't either," I replied, "but it happened." We were silent again, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew that kiss would change everything between us, but I didn't know how to deal with it. The only thing I knew was that I couldn't stay away from him. "Let's go inside," I suggested, trying to get away from the situation, but knowing that there was no escaping what we were feeling. We got up and went back into the house. The atmosphere was warmer, but the tension between us was palpable. We sat on the sofa side by side, not knowing what to say or do. I wanted to kiss him again, but guilt and fear stopped me. "Emily," he said, breaking the silence, "I don't want to hurt you. I know, John, but I don't know how to stop feeling that way." He took my hand again, and this time the touch was firmer, more decisive. Maybe we shouldn't stop. His words echoed in my mind. He was right. Maybe we shouldn't stop. Maybe what we were feeling was something we needed to explore, even if it was wrong. I leaned towards him again, and this time the kiss was more intense, more urgent. When we finally broke apart, we knew there was no turning back. The night of drinks and confessions had revealed feelings that we could no longer ignore. And somehow, that was just the first of many nights that would change our lives forever. Guilt washed over me whenever I thought of David. He was an incredible man, my husband, my partner. But at the same time, John's presence at the beach house stirred up feelings that I thought were dormant. I tried to stay away emotionally, keeping a safe distance from John, but it was almost impossible. Every time he passed close to me, our bodies almost touching, I felt a surge of electricity run through my body. I tried to ignore it, to concentrate on other things, but John's furtive touches increased the sexual tension between us. Sometimes he would lightly brush his hand against mine as we passed each other in the kitchen or living room. At other times, he always seemed to be close by, creating situations where our bodies bumped into each other. I knew I should back off, but something inside me craved those touches, those moments of closeness. One evening, I couldn't resist any longer. We were sitting on the balcony, watching the stars, when John touched my hand again. This time, I didn't flinch. I looked at him and saw a longing reflected in his eyes, something that mirrored what I felt. "Emily, I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and husky. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to run away, but another part wanted to surrender completely. "John, we can't..." "I'm married to David," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as him. "I know, but you're stronger than me. And I think he's stronger than you too," he replied, never looking away. I couldn't fight my feelings any longer. My body moved on its own, and before I knew it, we were kissing. It was an intense kiss, full of all the pent-up feelings. My resistance completely crumbled. I shouldn't be doing this," I said between kisses, trying to catch my breath. "Emily, look at me. Do you want me to stop?" John asked seriously. I knew I should say yes, but the words wouldn't come out. The desire was irresistible, and at that moment, I didn't want him to stop. "No, I don't want to," I finally admitted. We gave ourselves over to the desire that consumed us. Every touch, every kiss, every caress seemed to set my skin on fire. I knew I was betraying David, and that tortured me. But at the same time, the passion I felt for John was something I had never experienced before. After a while, we pulled away, both of us panting, trying to regain control. I looked at him, and the weight of the betrayal began to fall on me. "What are we doing, John?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't know, Emily, but I know I can't stop. You're too important to me," he replied. I knew I was committed to David, but the truth was that at that moment, nothing else mattered. The night passed slowly, full of furtive touches and complicit glances. I was torn between guilt and desire, but I couldn't help being drawn to John. That night, everything changed. The resistance I had tried to maintain for so long completely crumbled, and I gave in to the desire I felt for John. The guilt I felt for betraying David was overwhelming, but the passion that burned between us was something I couldn't ignore. That night, the silence in the beach house was almost palpable. Every noise seemed amplified by the weight of what was to come. John and I were sitting on the sofa, at a distance that felt like both an abyss and an invitation. My heart was pounding, a mixture of anxiety and desire. I knew the moment was approaching, but I couldn't predict how it would all unfold. "Emily," John said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about you." I turned my face towards him. Our gazes met, and an electric current ran through my body. The intensity in his eyes was undeniable, and I realized I was feeling the same. I wanted to resist. I wanted to remember David, but at that moment, emotion was stronger than reason. "John, we shouldn't," I started to say, but my voice failed me. He moved a little closer, and I could feel the warmth of his body. "I know," he replied, now so close that I could feel his breathing. But I can't help it. Before I could reply, he gently pulled me to him and our lips met. The kiss was soft at first, but quickly became urgent and full of desire. My hands tangled in his hair as he held me tightly, as if afraid to let me go. The room was lit only by the soft moonlight coming through the windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. Every touch, every movement seemed charged with meaning. I knew I was crossing a line from which there would be no turning back, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. We slid off the sofa and onto the floor, our bodies intertwining. Our clothes were taken off in a hurry, as if they were an obstacle between us and what we wanted so much. When we finally came together, the sensation was overwhelming. It was as if every cell in my body was on fire, consumed by a passion I had never felt before. John whispered my name over and over again, as if he wanted to imprint that moment in his memory forever. I couldn't hold back the words either, confessing feelings I didn't even know existed. Every movement, every touch, seemed to take us to a new level of pleasure. When we finally reached the apex, a mixture of ecstasy and guilt overtook me. The pleasure was intense, but the awareness of what we were doing also weighed heavily. After climaxing, we lay on the floor, panting and silent. The sound of the waves in the distance was the only noise that filled the room. "Emily," John said, breaking the silence once again. Don't say anything," I interrupted, putting a finger to his lips. "Let's just stay like this for a moment." He nodded and pulled me closer, wrapping me in his arms. In that instant, I felt a mixture of betrayal and ecstasy, a duality I had never imagined I would experience. I knew it would change everything, but I also knew I couldn't go back. We lay there, holding each other, until tiredness overcame us and we fell asleep. The last thing I heard before falling asleep was the sound of John's heart beating in sync with mine. I woke up to sunlight filtering through the thin curtains of the bedroom. My body was still warm and relaxed next to John. For a brief moment, a sense of reality hit me, and I allowed myself to enjoy the moment. But soon the guilt began to creep in, bringing with it the memory of David, my husband, and the life I was betraying. John was still asleep next to me, and watching him so serene brought me mixed feelings. There was something incredibly intimate about seeing him like this, carefree after the night we had shared. I got up slowly, trying not to wake him. I needed a moment to organize my thoughts before facing the day. In the kitchen, I prepared the coffee, trying to act as normal as possible. I didn't know what to say to John when he woke up. How could I deal with what we had done? My thoughts were confused, my heart torn between the overwhelming passion for John and the loyalty I owed David. John came into the kitchen, still sleepy, and sat down at the table. I could tell by the way he looked at me that he too was trying to understand what it all meant. "Good morning," he said with a shy smile. "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Would you like some coffee?" He nodded, and I poured 2 cups. We sat at the table, a heavy silence between us. I didn't know how to start the conversation, so I began with the obvious. "What now?" I asked, without looking directly at him. "I don't know, Emily," he answered truthfully. "Last night was incredible, but we can't ignore what that means." I sighed, feeling reality weigh on my shoulders. I know. I feel guilty. David doesn't deserve this." "What about us?" he asked, with a look that seemed to pierce my soul. "What happened between us? Do you think it was a mistake?" I shook my head, unable to give a straight answer. "I don't know, John. I just know it was real. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm married." He nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. We sat in silence for a while longer, just sipping our coffee. Every glance we exchanged seemed to carry unspoken meanings, a connection that couldn't be ignored, but couldn't be easily explained either. "We need to be discreet," he finally said. "No one can know what happened here." "I agree," I replied, even though the idea of hiding what we felt made my stomach knot up. We finished breakfast in complicit silence, exchanging furtive glances and small smiles, as if we were conspiring together. The fear of being discovered was always there, but the connection I felt with John was undeniable. I tried to act normal, to clean the kitchen, to tidy up the house, but every movement seemed loaded with meaning. When we finally sat down in the living room, John took my hand. His touch was firm, but gentle at the same time, as if he wanted to comfort me without putting pressure on me. "Emily, I don't want this to destroy your life," he said, with sincerity in his eyes. "But I can't pretend I don't feel anything for you either." I felt tears forming in my eyes. "I feel for you too, John. But I'm so confused. I love David, but what I feel for you is different. It's intense." He stroked my hand, as if his words weren't enough to express what he felt. "Let's take things one step at a time. Let's see how things unfold. We don't need to make any decisions now." I nodded, knowing he was right. We had to be careful, think about every move. But part of me knew that whatever happened, I would never forget that morning. That feeling of being torn between two loves. And, for now, that would have to be enough. As we finished our coffee, exchanging complicit glances and secret smiles, the fear that someone would find out what had happened hung over us. But at that moment, all that mattered was the memory of last night and the unspoken promise that we would somehow find a way to deal with the consequences. When I decided to spend the weekend at the beach house, all I wanted was some peace and quiet. David was traveling for work, and I needed some time to myself. I arrived on Friday afternoon, with the sun already setting over the horizon. The sea breeze brought immediate relief, and I felt ready to relax. I opened the door of the house with the key I always carried with me, and, to my surprise, found my cousin John already settled in the living room. He was sitting on the sofa, reading a book, and looked up when he saw me come in. "Emily?" he said, with a mixture of surprise and joy in his voice. "I didn't know you were coming." "John? What are you doing here?" I asked, trying not to let my shock show. "My flight was canceled. I thought I could stay here for a few days," he explained, getting up to greet me. The look we exchanged was intense, full of memories and meanings that went beyond words. There was something there, something I couldn't define, but which made me uncomfortable and excited at the same time. The tension was palpable as we settled into the house. I went to my room, trying to concentrate on unpacking and organizing my things, but my mind was racing. John was different, more mature, more sure of himself, and that moved me in a way I hadn't expected. That night, the house seemed smaller than it really was. Every movement, every word exchanged seemed to carry a greater weight. "Would you like some dinner?" I asked, trying to break the ice. "Sure, I'll cook for us," he replied, smiling in a way that made my heart race. We had dinner together, chatting about trivial things, but the tension in the air was undeniable. I couldn't help glancing at him from time to time, and judging by the way he looked at me, he felt something too. When we finally went to sleep, I lay down on my bed, but sleep didn't come. I kept thinking about John in the next room, how his presence awakened feelings that I thought had been buried for a long time. The next morning, we decided to extend our stay at the beach house. The weather was wonderful, and the idea of returning to our routine seemed distant and unwelcome. The days passed between walks on the beach, deep conversations, and moments of intimacy that only increased our connection. "Emily, do you remember when we were children?" John asked one evening as we sat on the balcony, looking out to sea. "Of course I do. We spent hours playing together. You were my best friend," I replied, smiling at the memory. "And you were my confidant," he added, taking my hand. His touch was soft, but full of meaning. The feeling of living a forbidden dream was constant. Every moment with John was intense and full of emotion. The difficulty of hiding the passion that was growing between us increased every day. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stay away. "Emily, what are we doing?" John asked, in a moment of clarity. "I don't know, John. All I know is that I don't want to stop," I replied, feeling a mixture of guilt and desire. The days turned into a whirlwind of feelings. With each shared moment of intimacy and adventure, I felt more attached to him. It felt like we were in a world apart, where only the two of us existed. "Emily, I don't want this to end," John said, holding my face between his hands. "Neither do I replied, knowing that, despite the fear of someone finding out, I didn't want to give up what we were experiencing. The long weekend was like a dream, a refuge from reality. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last forever. The passion that consumed us was intense, but also dangerous. With every touch, every kiss, the line between right and wrong became thinner. I knew that, eventually, we would have to face reality. But for now, all that mattered was the present, the here and now. And as much as guilt and fear haunted me, I couldn't resist John. The beach house became our secret refuge, a place where we could be ourselves, away from judgments and expectations. And as long as we were there, together, nothing else mattered. The journey home was silent and painful. John and I exchanged few words, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every kilometer we drove felt like a piece of my heart was being ripped out. He drove with his gaze fixed on the road, while I stared out of the window, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. I knew that, at the end of that journey, our brief, intense adventure would come to an end. When we finally arrived at my house, John stopped the car in the driveway. The light of the sunset bathed the facade of the house, giving everything an unreal golden hue. He turned to me, and our gazes met. No words were spoken, but pain and desire were clearly reflected in his eyes. I got out of the car, and he stood there, watching me get in. David welcomed me with a warm hug. His smile was genuine, and he was oblivious to everything that had happened over the weekend. I felt a lump in my throat and returned the hug, trying to hide the guilt that was consuming me. He asked me how the weekend at the beach house had been, and I replied that it had been peaceful and relaxing. The words came out with difficulty, and my mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. Over dinner, David told me about his weekend, the things he did and the people he met. I listened, but my mind was far away, constantly going back to John and the moments we shared at the beach house. The internal struggle to hide my emotions was exhausting. Every smile I gave, every word I said, felt like a lie. But I knew I couldn't let anything show. David didn't deserve that. When we finally lay down to sleep, David pulled me closer, and I felt his warmth next to me. I closed my eyes and tried to shut out thoughts of John, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his touch, heard his voice whispering my name. Guilt mixed with longing was a devastating combination. The next few days were a real torment. Memories of John and what we had experienced together at the beach house were always present. I tried to concentrate on work, on my daily tasks, but everything seemed pointless. I looked at David and felt a deep pain in my chest. He had trusted me, and I had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. But at the same time, I couldn't get John out of my head. The nights were even worse. Lying next to David, my mind wandered to John. I thought of the passionate moments, the deep conversations, the laughter we shared. It was as if I was living two parallel lives, one with David and one in my mind with John. The internal struggle to keep these two lives separate was exhausting. One day, while I was at work, I received a message from John. My heart raced when I saw his name on the screen. He said he missed me, that he couldn't stop thinking about me. I replied that I felt the same way, and that simple exchange of messages brought a little relief to my turbulent soul. Knowing that he was suffering too made me feel less alone. The days turned into weeks, and communication with John became a constant. We exchanged messages in secret, trying to maintain the facade of a normal life with David. Every message, every word exchanged, was a reminder of what we had experienced and how we still felt about each other. It was a relief and, at the same time, torture. One day, John suggested that we meet. My heart raced as I read his message. I knew it was risky, but the longing was unbearable. We arranged to meet in a discreet cafe, far from where anyone would recognize us. When I finally arrived at the cafe and saw him, my heart nearly burst out of my mouth. He was sitting at a table in the corner, and our gazes met as soon as I entered. "Emily," he said, getting up to greet me. His voice was soft, but full of emotion. "John," I replied, feeling my hands shaking. We sat down and started talking, trying to act naturally. But the tension between us was palpable. Every word exchanged, every glance, was full of meaning and memories. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, holding my hand for a brief moment. "I can't either," I admitted, feeling tears gathering in my eyes. "But it's wrong. David." "I know," he interrupted, looking down. "But what we feel is real." We left the cafe together, and he pulled me into a tight hug. I felt his heart beating against mine, and the pain of separation was almost unbearable. We knew we couldn't go through with it, but the attraction and love were too strong to ignore. I returned home with a heavy heart. Every time I looked at David, I felt guilt consume me. He deserved to know the truth, but I didn't have the courage to tell him. The fear of losing everything we had built together was paralyzing. But at the same time, I couldn't forget John and what we had experienced. That night, lying next to David, I felt a deep emptiness. He pulled me closer, and I closed my eyes, trying to shut out thoughts of John. But deep down, I knew that this internal struggle was far from over. What I'd experienced with John at the beach house had changed everything, and now it was a part of me that I couldn't simply erase. I never imagined that my life would change so much after that weekend at the beach house. Now I'm here, living a split reality, balancing between two lives. It all started with secret text messages with John. I knew I was playing with fire, but the excitement and adrenaline were irresistible. "Good morning, cousin. Thinking of you," said the first message I received from John after our intense weekend. My heart skipped a beat when I read those words. I replied quickly, trying not to sound anxious. "Good morning. I'm thinking about you too." Our text exchanges became more and more frequent. I found myself smiling at the phone, waiting anxiously for a new message. John had a way of making me feel alive, something I hadn't felt for a long time in my marriage to David. "Can we meet up this week?" he suggested in one of the messages. My heart raced. The idea of seeing him again was tempting, but also dangerous. "Where?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Somewhere discreet. I know a cafe where no one knows us." We met in that cafe on Thursday afternoon. I was nervous, looking around to see if anyone I knew would show up. When John walked in, I felt a mixture of joy and guilt. He smiled when he saw me and approached me. "Hi, Emily. I missed you," he said, holding my hand for a moment. We chatted about trivial matters, but the tension between us was palpable. "Do you think about what happened?" he asked in a whisper. "All the time," I confessed, feeling my face flush. He smiled and squeezed my hand. "Me too." Our furtive encounters became a routine. We found discreet places, away from prying eyes. Every touch, every stolen kiss, increased the intensity of what we felt. I knew I was taking a risk, but I couldn't stop. At home, my life with David continued. He was attentive and affectionate, without suspecting a thing. I felt guilty every time I looked at him, but at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about John. It was like living two parallel lives. One day, David surprised me with a romantic dinner at home. "I thought you deserved a treat," he said with a smile. I smiled back, trying to hide the guilt that was consuming me. "You're amazing, David," I said, feeling a lump in my throat. During dinner, my cell phone vibrated with a message from John. "Thinking of you," it said. I looked at David, who was busy pouring the wine, and quickly replied, "I'm thinking of you too." That night was particularly difficult. David was so attentive, and I felt like a traitor. After he fell asleep, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how complicated my life had become. I loved David, but my feelings for John were undeniable. The encounters with John continued. We took more and more risks, looking for moments alone in more and more daring places. "This is crazy," I said to him on one of these dates. "I know, but I can't stop," he replied, pulling me into a passionate kiss. Maintaining the facade of a normal life with David became increasingly difficult. I found myself distracted, thinking about John, about our times together. David noticed my change. "Are you okay, Emily? You seem distant," he asked one evening. "I'm just tired," I lied, trying to sound convincing. He hugged me, and I felt a wave of guilt. I knew I was betraying his trust, but I couldn't stop. John was like an addiction. Living two parallel lives was exhausting. I was always on alert, fearing that someone would find out. But at the same time, every moment with John was intense and passionate. This is going to end badly, I thought several times, but the attraction was too strong to ignore. The feeling of being torn apart consumed me. I wanted to find a way to reconcile everything, but I knew it was impossible. Every message, every furtive encounter, reminded me of the risk I was taking, but I couldn't stop. John and I knew we were playing a dangerous game, but neither of us wanted to stop. The excitement, the adrenaline and the passion were irresistible. We were living a fantasy, something we knew was temporary, but that we couldn't let go of. Secret communication with John became my new reality. I knew I was cheating on David, but every time I thought about breaking up, I felt an emptiness. John filled something in me that I didn't even know was missing. Living two lives was exhausting and exciting at the same time. I didn't know how long I could keep up this facade, but for now, every moment was worth it. With every message, every meeting, I felt more alive and more divided. The reality of my betrayal was there, present every day. I knew I was living a lie, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. John had become part of me, and despite the guilt, I didn't want to lose that. Living two lives was my new reality, and I would have to learn to deal with it. The future had always seemed like a straight line to me, until that weekend at the beach house. Now, everything seems like a jumble of feelings and choices I never thought I'd have to make. I'm sitting on the balcony of my house, looking out to sea, and all I can think about is John. The sea breeze brings a smell of salt that reminds me of the two of us together, of our laughter, of our complicit glances. But it also brings back the memory of betrayal, of the guilt I carry with me. "Emily, are you all right?" David asks, coming closer. I startle, lost in my thoughts. Yes, I'm just thinking a bit, I reply, trying to smile. He looks at me lovingly, without suspecting a thing. That's what hurts the most. He's a good man, and he doesn't deserve what I'm doing. You've been distant lately. I miss you, he says, holding my hand. His words are like a knife in my heart, but I smile and squeeze his hand back. I miss you too. I just have a lot on my mind, I lie. He pulls me into a hug, and I close my eyes, trying to push the image of John out of my mind. But it's impossible. Since that weekend, everything has changed. I try to act normally, but my mind always goes back to those moments. The text messages we exchange in secret are like an addiction. Every time my cell phone vibrates, my heart races. I find myself smiling to myself, remembering our conversations, our furtive encounters. It's like living two parallel lives. We need to talk about the future, John wrote in one of the messages. Just reading that made my heart race. I knew he was right. We couldn't go on like this forever, but the thought of losing what we had terrified me. I don't know what to do, I replied. It was the truth. I was torn between my love for David and my overwhelming passion for John. Every time I thought about ending things with John, I felt a huge emptiness. But continuing with this betrayal was also destroying me inside. I don't know either, but we need to decide something, he insisted. And I knew he was right. Keep putting off the decision only made it harder. David calls me to dinner, and I force myself out of my thoughts. I sit at the table and try to concentrate on the conversation, but my mind keeps going back to John. I remember how he looked at me, how he made me feel alive. It's a feeling I've never had with David, and it scares me. After dinner, I go upstairs to my room and pick up my cell phone. There's a message from John. We need to meet up. I can't go on like this. My heart squeezes. I know he's suffering as much as I am, but the idea of us meeting again fills me with fear and desire at the same time. When and where? I answer. My hands shake as I type. I know I'm about to make another mistake, but I can't help it. The temptation is too strong. At that coffee shop by the beach tomorrow at 3 p.m., he writes. I confirm and turn off my cell phone, feeling a mixture of anxiety and guilt. I lie down on the bed next to David, who is already asleep. I look at him and feel a wave of sadness. He doesn't deserve this, but at the same time, I can't imagine my life without John now. I close my eyes and try to sleep, but my mind keeps racing, thinking about tomorrow's meeting. The next day, I make up an excuse to leave the house. I tell David that I need to sort out some things in town. He kisses me on the forehead and tells me he loves me. I smile, but inside I'm falling apart. I arrive at the cafe and see John already sitting there, waiting for me. He smiles when he sees me, but his gaze is serious. I sit down opposite him, and he takes my hand. Emily, we can't go on like this, he says, straight to the point. I nod, feeling tears forming in my eyes. I know, John, but what are we going to do? I can't just abandon David? He doesn't deserve that, I say, my voice breaking. I know, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel anything for you either. It's killing me, he replies, squeezing my hand. I feel my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. I know he's right, but the thought of losing John destroys me. Maybe we can carry on like this in secret until we find a way to resolve this, I suggest, even though I know this isn't the ideal solution. It's a desperate attempt to prolong the inevitable. John sighs, looking tired. Emily, I don't want to be your secret. I want to be with you for real. But if that's what you need right now, I'll accept it. We just can't go on like this forever. I agree, knowing that I'm just putting off the difficult decision. We leave the cafe, and he hugs me tightly. "I love you, Emily. Don't forget that." I kiss him, feeling a mixture of love and guilt consume me. I return home and find David on the sofa, waiting for me. He smiles when he sees me, and I feel a twinge of pain in my chest. I sit down next to him, and he pulls me into a hug. "How was your day?" he asks. "It was good. I sorted out what I needed to." I lie again. He kisses my forehead, and I close my eyes, trying to shake off the guilt. The future is uncertain, and I know I can't go on living like this forever. But for now, this is my reality. A life divided between two loves, two passions, and I don't know how or when it will end.